Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to get in touch with us, then you can give us a call or send a text to 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. Those are great ways to submit your questions to us if you would like us to address a particular topic on a future program, or if you just have something that has been grating at your mind and something that you would like to discuss further from a scriptural perspective and find out what God's will is about something. I'd be happy to study anything with you in greater detail. If you would like to sign up for either a one-off or a longer-term study, then feel free to reach out and get in touch. You can arrange that with me or with another one of our members. You can also find a lot of study resources on our website. Those are both in the form of articles that I have written or that others have written, and plenty of other resources and links and that sort of thing to help guide you along your journey as you try to understand God and His will better. And our Facebook page and our YouTube channel have not only all of the past TV programs uploaded to them, but also our past live-streamed worship services. And on YouTube in particular, you can find our weekly live-stream services, our morning Bible study at Sundays at 9, and then our Sunday morning worship at 10. You can also find our Sunday afternoon worship at 4, and our Wednesday evening Bible study at 7. You're also welcome to join us in person, of course, for any and all of those. Our address is 5600 Van Road in Newburgh, Indiana. If you are a regular viewer of this program, then you will be familiar with our series of overviews. We've been looking at various parts of the Bible, and we started with looking at the entire Bible, and we've managed to cram that into a half hour, and then we looked at the Old Testament and then the New Testament. We even spent some time on the Apocrypha, and then we looked at the different sections, the different collections of different types of books that we find throughout the Bible. And finally, more recently, we have gotten into looking at books one at a time. We just started that. The last installment was on the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. So, since Genesis begins the Old Testament, I thought it would be appropriate to, right after that, follow up with the beginning of the New Testament in Matthew's Gospel. What we're going to do is examine this first one of the Gospels that we find in the Bible, and the story of Jesus and His life on earth, and we're going to ask ourselves what sets this one apart from the other three. And we'll be on the lookout as well for the major lessons that we can learn from this book today. So, Matthew. As I said, this is the first of the Gospels in the biblical canon. Why are there 4 of these things in the first place? Why do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and not just one book called the Gospel of Jesus Christ? And if they're different from each other, as they certainly are, then what can we learn from this one that is different from what we would get out of the other 3? What sets Matthew apart from the other 3? What we're going to do is to examine the book as a whole, including the major themes present in it and sort of a surface level look at the contents. We just don't have time, of course, to get into it in great detail. As we do this, though, be on the lookout for lessons about who Jesus is and what He means for you. The author of this book is actually not named. If you start reading at the very beginning, verse 1 says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and then it goes into that genealogy. There's no indication in the text itself as to who wrote it. Now, of course, there's a title right above it that says the Gospel according to Matthew, and I'm sure that's the case in your Bible as well. That is a very old tradition, but it's technically anonymous, as all of the Gospels are. But it is a very old tradition, and no one really challenged it in the first several centuries of the Church's existence. This was a time when a lot of lies were being put forth, and generally speaking, the Christian thinkers of that era did a good job of sorting out the fact from the fiction. Not always, but for the most part. No one throughout that period made any serious challenge to the idea that Matthew the Apostle was the author of this book. We don't actually know the date. I can't give you a clear number, but it's probably written in the 50s or 60s or so. There's another thing that I should point out about the dating of Matthew. It's often assumed that Matthew came significantly later, not in the 50s or 60s, but after the year 70. Why the year 70, you ask? Well, because that's when the city of Jerusalem fell to the Romans. What does that have to do with anything, you ask? Well, in Matthew's Gospel, we find Jesus making some stunningly clear predictions about the fall of Jerusalem. So, if you discount completely the idea that Jesus could be uttering prophecies, and thus undermine the entire point of the Gospels, then I suppose that would be reason to assume that this book couldn't have been written until those events in the year 70 had already occurred. But then you don't have a whole lot of reason to care about it anyway, do you? Let's move on. The date really doesn't matter in the end anyway. Let's talk about the purpose. Why was this written? Matthew's Gospel is focused on Jesus as he relates to the Jewish nation. There will be more on this later, but let's begin by rereading verse 1 and going down through verse 4 of the first chapter. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon. It just keeps going for a rather long time at this stage. Genealogies were very important to the Jews. God had implemented his law in such a way as to encourage them to pay close attention to their lineage. God names himself the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob in his discussions with the people on a fairly regular basis. Not only do they trace their lineage back to Abraham, but they trace their blessings back to him. That's more or less the entire point of the book of Genesis, as you know if you watched that episode a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so let's move on from the Jewish flavor that we've already seen so far. The structure of the book is a little bit odd in comparison with Matthew and Luke. That's not to say that it doesn't flow well. In fact, I tend to think that Matthew flows better than the other two do. But from a timeline perspective, it doesn't match up very well. And that suggests that it's not actually arranged entirely chronologically. Now, that's certainly involved. I mean, Matthew starts with Jesus' birth, and then he ends with Jesus' death and resurrection, and there's definitely a temporal component to those decisions and several of the ones in between. But by and large, at least during the roughly 3-year period of Jesus' earthly ministry, it appears that Matthew chose to arrange most of the contents of his gospel topically rather than chronologically. And if he's going to arrange this topically, then that provides a good opportunity for us to get into the next point, the major themes of this book. There are a lot of these. We're not going to discuss all of them because, again, we just don't have time. But the ones that really stand out from the other 3 Gospels are as follows. Jesus' teaching, the kingdom of heaven, the Son of David, prophecy, and finally, the significance of Christ to the Gentiles. That's right, even in this book that is about Christ and his relationship to the Jews, Matthew is going to highlight that it's not just for the Jews. So let's start with the first theme, the teaching. Matthew has a great focus on Jesus' teaching in a way that sets his gospel apart from the other 3, I would say. Matthew actually arranges his gospel around 5 major sermons or speeches by Jesus. It's not just a snippet here, a tidbit there. It involves very large, bulky sermons that Jesus gave. And so, for example, if you look at chapters 5 through 7, we have a long sermon. We call it Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of the touchstone for understanding Jesus' teaching. Now, the term Sermon on the Mount isn't all that descriptive. I prefer to call it something like beyond the law, because that's what Jesus is trying to preach to these people. But the Sermon on the Mount is not the only sermon that Jesus delivers over the course of Matthew's Gospel. In chapter 10, we find him preaching at great length about, well, going out and preaching. He is sending out his apostles to do the same sort of work that he has been doing, and he takes pains to prepare them as well as he can with this extended section of teaching. In chapter 13, we find a collection. It doesn't appear to be chronological, as if Jesus gave all these parables one right after the other, but the parables are collected into chapter 13 of Matthew's Gospel. In chapter 18, we find him giving another sermon. It's, again, rather lengthy, and it has to do with relationships in the kingdom of heaven. In chapters 24 and 25, we find another pretty long discourse that is about the end. Or maybe the ends, plural, would be a better way to term that, because he's mostly talking, at least at the beginning of chapter 24, about the coming fall of Jerusalem, which was still several decades away, but it was within the lifetime of that generation. And yet by the end of it, it seems as though that's not the only thing he has in mind, that he's looking for a greater end that is only symbolized by the siege and fall of Jerusalem to come in the next little bit. Okay, so those 5 sermons are pretty major. Those are not the only times that Jesus speaks, of course. They're not even the only times that Jesus speaks at length, but they are the longest. And there's also sort of a pattern to be found in the endings of each of these sermons. In chapter 7, let's read verse 28. "And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching." So that's the end of the Sermon on the Mount, or beyond the law. Chapter 11, verse 1, directly following his preaching about going out and preaching, "When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities." That sounds kind of similar, doesn't it? In chapter 13, after the long collection of parables, in verse 53 we find, "And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there." In chapter 19, after the long discussion of relationships in the kingdom of heaven, in verse 1 of chapter 19, we read, "Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan." And finally, after the talk about the end for Jerusalem and perhaps the end for everybody, we read in verse 1 of chapter 26, "When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, 'You know,' etc., etc." That pattern is indicative of a deliberate formula that Matthew is using. He's saying, another of the great speeches has concluded, now let's move on to the next thing. He couches it in chronological terms, which we have no reason to doubt are accurate, but he has a thematic arrangement in mind. So that covers the first theme of Jesus' teaching. Now let's move on to the second one, the kingdom of heaven. Let me illustrate Matthew's focus on the kingdom of heaven by giving you a comparison of the 4 gospel writers' use of the phrase kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God. Mark uses it 17 times. That's a lot. That's more than 1 per chapter. Now Luke, he does quite a bit more than that. He uses it 37 times. So he seems to be a lot more focused on this kingdom of heaven notion than Mark was. John, in his gospel, uses it, how many do you think? 4. Matthew uses the term kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God 49 times, which suggests that it might be important. I've already mentioned that one of the 5 sermons that Jesus delivered in chapter 18 of Matthew has to do with relationships, but it's not just relationships in the way they ought to be, it's relationships in the kingdom of heaven. This is how it will work. This is how it is supposed to work in the kingdom of heaven. And he gives a lot of prescriptions about how we are to behave in the kingdom. Okay, let's move on from that and get to the third theme, the Son of David. It's kind of like the kingdom of heaven, and we can illustrate it in the same way. The term Son of David doesn't refer specifically to the first generation male offspring of King David. It refers to a descendant, and a rather important descendant of David. It comes from Old Testament prophecies. It is a very distinctively Jewish notion of the significance of the Messiah, that he was to rule on the throne of his father David, that he was to be a king like David, a man after God's own heart, you might say. So how many times do each of the authors of the 4 Gospels use this term Son of David? Well, this time let's count in ascending order. John's Gospel uses this term 0 times. Mark's Gospel uses it twice. Luke uses it 3 times. And what about Matthew? Matthew uses it 10 times-ish. One of those actually refers to Joseph, the adoptive father of Jesus, but he is still tying him to the Messiah for a very good reason. The Son of David. Now, Jesus is not, as I said, the first generation male offspring of David the king, but he inherits the promises that were given to David. He inherits the authority that was given to David. In fact, he inherits something far greater. He inherits, well, let's go back to Psalm 2. In Psalm 2, verse 6, God says, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." He's referring there to David and David's descendants, the kings of Judah, who reigned from Zion in Jerusalem. And then the following verse says, "I will tell of the decree, the Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." This is about the Messiah. But it's not just about the Messiah. They didn't even realize for a long time that it was about the Messiah. They looked at it as being about the kings of Judah, the offspring of David. They reigned on David's throne through heritage. God gave them that possession, and he looked at them as being his children. "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Well, of course, when it comes to the Messiah, that seems to be true in a much more directly real sense, doesn't it? He is God's son. And in a much more complete sense, he inherits the nations and the ends of the earth. In a much more complete sense, he will break them with a rod of iron. That's something that John picks up in Revelation and mentions a number of times, that the Messiah rules the nations with a rod of iron. So the Son of David is a major theme throughout Matthew's Gospel. This idea of taking up the mantle of David, so to speak, and sitting down on David's throne and becoming the king of the line of David and fulfilling that promise, which brings us to the fourth theme, the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, which is to say the Jewish prophecies. You can see up on your screen right now all of the references where Matthew specifically points out that Jesus is fulfilling prophecies in the Old Testament. We're not going to read all of these, and this isn't even every prophecy that Jesus fulfills, even in Matthew's Gospel. These are just the ones that Matthew happens to point out. He specifically tells us that it's happening. Let's read a couple of them. "This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." This quotation from Zechariah chapter 9 has to do with Jesus entering in Jerusalem as the conquering king. There's another one in chapter 12 from the prophet Isaiah. "This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench, until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope." So we've got Jesus here in this instance fulfilling, well, several aspects of these predictions that came through Isaiah. But the reason that I wanted to pick this one specifically is because it twice mentions the Gentiles, even in the Old Testament prophecies. And that brings us to theme number 5, that in this Jewish-centered gospel, oddly enough, we see a great focus on the significance of Christ to the Gentiles. Let me illustrate this a little bit. At the beginning of the gospel, of course, we find Jesus' birth. And when he is born, the little mini-story that Matthew decides is important enough to include has to do with wise men who come to visit him. From where do they come? From the east. We're talking about Gentiles. And as it happens, these Gentiles are the first to recognize, outside of direct revelations from God, who Jesus is. They are the first to worship him. We can see that in the first 2 verses of chapter 2. "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Gentiles are the first ones to worship the Messiah. And in fact, the Jewish king wants to kill the Messiah in that story. In chapter 8, let's read verses 10 and 11 for another example of this Gentile focus. "When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. This is in the wake of a Gentile centurion, a sort of non-commissioned officer in the army of Rome, asking Jesus for help, for healing of his servant. Jesus commends this Gentile's faith and says that a lot of Gentiles are going to come and recline at Abraham's table in the kingdom. And he's even pointing out the absurdity of this situation, where the Israelites have less faith than the Gentiles do in the Messiah. Important theme, focus on the Gentiles. But we've been dancing around, and I think it's worthwhile to spend at least a little bit of time marching through, and while we don't have time to read very much, we can at least get an idea of what occurs at what stage of the story. In chapter 1, we find Jesus' genealogy and his birth. In chapter 2, the wise men come to visit, and as a result of the Jewish king wanting to kill Jesus, Jesus and his family flee to Egypt. Well, it's more that his family flees, and they take baby Jesus along with them. Eventually, they make their way back to Nazareth. In chapter 3, John the Baptist is preparing the way of the Lord, and in chapter 4, Jesus, having recently been baptized, is tempted by Satan as he is preparing to begin his earthly ministry. The next thing we find is chapters 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, which we've already discussed a bit. Chapters 8 and 9 cover Jesus' healing and more of his teaching and more of his miracles, and then by chapter 10, we find him giving another sermon. This time it's the sermon about preaching. In chapters 11 and 12, Jesus is doing some more teaching and also answering some questions. In chapter 13, as we have discussed already, he goes through a long collection of parables. In chapter 14, we cover the death of John the Baptist and some more miracles from Jesus. In chapters 15 and 16, we have Jesus doing more miracles and doing some more teaching. And by the end of chapter 16, we are starting to see that events are moving toward Jesus' death. Chapter 17 covers Jesus' transfiguration on a mountain in the wilderness, after which we find more of his teaching and miracles. Might be noticing that that's pretty common. Chapters 18 through 20 cover relationships, especially in the church, and we have discussed that briefly already. Chapters 21 and 22 continue the march toward Jesus' crucifixion, as well as a few more parables. Chapter 23 has Jesus preaching 7 woes against the scribes and Pharisees, these religious leaders among the Jews. Chapters 24 and 25, we have already discussed the predictions of the end to come. Chapters 26 and 27 cover the plot against Jesus and his execution. Let's read a couple of selections from this because, well, we have to. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani? That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, This man is calling Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. Let's pick up in verse 59. And Joseph took the body, and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb, and went away. This shapes up to be a very poignant account of Christ's death and burial. And of course, it is punctuated in chapter 28 with Jesus' resurrection, which is a glorious picture of Jesus' triumph, his victory over death and over Satan. And it's a prediction of a new beginning, of what Jesus expects to happen now. How does the book close? Now the 11 disciples, that's because Judas is no more, went to Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, to the end of the age. So, what do we take from Matthew? It's hard to say that we have a complete picture based on the rather small amount of time we've been able to dedicate to it today, and frankly, we've read very little of Jesus' actual teaching. But there is a major trend in what we have been able to study. We divided the book into 18 parts, and 11 of those 18 included Jesus' teaching as a major focus. How well do you know what Jesus actually said? Not just what he did or what was done to him, but what he actually taught. For most people, in fact, frankly, even most Christians, the answer to that would be not well enough. Matthew seems to have thought that we should pay close attention to his teaching. The verses that we just read at the end of the gospel indicate that Jesus himself thinks we ought to pay close attention to the commandments he taught. We also saw this focus on the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Of course, that took the form of the prophecies in the Old Testament, also the Son of David thing in the kingdom of heaven. All of that rolls up into one. But it's not just about Israel, is it? Even in this quintessentially Jewish gospel, Matthew wants to make it clear that Jesus is here for the Gentiles too, and that was always the plan. We should be appreciative of that. Recognize that all of those prophecies are important. It's not just that they exist, but what they actually say. Maybe give a little bit more attention to the Old Testament than you otherwise would have thought it deserves. The Old Testament contains just as much for you to learn about God as the New. In fact, I would argue the Old Testament contains more. It comprises 3/4 of the Bible, doesn't it? And then there's this whole thing about the kingdom. Not just the term, not just the phrase kingdom of heaven and Matthew's focus on it, but the very idea of a kingdom. Subjects and a ruler. We have a choice whether to be citizens in that kingdom or rebels against the throne. Let's look at one of the parables found in Matthew and wrap up with that. In Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 47. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Are you a good fish or a bad one? It's not a particularly flattering way to look at ourselves, but it's honest, isn't it? On the grand scale, you and I can be simplified down to this one thing. Are you worth keeping or not? We generally know what to do in order to make ourselves worth keeping. And if you don't know those things, then, well, I guess refer back to the admonition about learning Jesus' teaching. It's all right there, and you can find most of it in Matthew. What remains is for us to ensure we make the cut. The alternative isn't just to be told, sorry, you didn't make the team. It's to be thrown into the place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. How do you like that idea? If you want to make sure that you are worth keeping, then please get in touch with us at River Ridge. You can find us on Facebook or YouTube to learn more, or reach out directly to 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org with questions, to sign up for our weekly bulletin, or to set up an appointment to study with me or another of our members. You can also join us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh at 9 a.m. Sunday for Bible study and 10 a.m. for worship. We also gather at 4 on Sunday afternoons and at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.